of you may know, much of TANGO's resilience research in the Sahel is being carried out through the Resilience Evaluation, Analysis, and Learning, or REAL Award, which is funded by and implemented in coordination with the USAID Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. The REAL Award was established to respond to growing demand among USAID missions, host governments, implementing organizations, and other key stakeholders for rigorous yet practical monitoring, evaluation, strategic analysis, and capacity building support related to resilience. Given the scale of resilience investments in the region and the expanding evidence base on the drivers of resilience in the Sahel, the REAL partners, including Save the Children, Mercy Corps, and TANGO International, are excited about the opportunity to coordinate with the Sahel collaboration and communication activity to share these findings. Our ongoing coordination with SEC is aimed at ensuring that resilience analysis carried out by REAL partners in the Sahel responds to the evidence needs of implementing partners, national governments, and donor representatives throughout the region, each of whom are dedicated to strengthening the resilience of communities exposed to a range of complex and interrelated shocks and stresses. With that, I'd like to introduce Maggie Janes Lucas, Chief of Party for SEC, to offer a few opening remarks.
Hi, thanks, Tom. It's great to be here today and to see all of the fantastic participants that are joining us from around the world. I'm really excited to see this whole list that keeps popping up here. A lot of folks I know, so I'm really glad that there's lots of representation from Niger and Burkina. As Tom said, I'm Maggie Janes Lucas. I am based in Niger, but I am the Chief of Party for the Sahel Collaboration and Communication Activity, which covers Niger and Burkina Faso. Our project focuses on resilience-centered collaboration, learning, adaptive management, and communication, helping to illustrate USAID's collective impact across the Sahel, and specifically in Niger and in Burkina Faso. So we have a team in Niger and in Burkina Faso, and a lot of my team is on the call today as well, and we're really thrilled to work with REAL and USAID and TANGO on this webinar today that you're all going to be joining in. And I think we'll get a lot out of it. And there's a lot of plans that we have going forward for smaller activities at the country level to look at this data even further. So thanks a lot. And with that, I want to introduce Mr. Peter Trenchard, who is the mission director for Senegal and the Sahel Regional Office. And he is based in Dakar. And we're thrilled that he's able to join us today because the data that we're going to see coming out of this report, I think, is critical at both the regional level and at the very country-specific levels. So thank you again, Peter, for joining us. We've got a whole slew of your team members with us as well as folks from Burkina and Niger USAID. So I turn it over to you to give a welcome.
Thank you, and yes, indeed, I'm really happy to be here today. And so greetings, everybody, and welcome. This is our first presentation to share the findings of the Resilience in the Sahel Enhanced RISE Recurrent Monitoring Surveys, the RMS, in Niger and Burkina Faso, which covers the period of August 2018 through April 2019. And this study set out to evaluate the well-being and ability of households to cope and recover from shocks over time. It's a rich data set, and its analysis illustrates the ongoing work needed and helps pave the way forward. I'm very grateful for all of you joining today to discuss the results and hear your questions and insights from this important study. And I particularly like to thank TANGO International, SASAO, the team that implemented SAREL, and the many contributors for the work to implement the RMS, analyze the data, and prepare the results to share with all of us today. And I especially want to take a moment to welcome each of you, our stakeholders, implementing partners and collaborators, which I see a long list over to the right side of my screen, from wherever you sit around the world. And I want to recognize also the participation of our new USA leadership in Niger, especially Joe Lesser-Olten, the new Niger Mission Director, and her team, who's joining us today. We're very happy to have her here. And also like to recognize the USA team in Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Kathy Yonker, who is acting USA country rep. Very glad to see everybody online. We continue to test and understanding our resilience work and then refine approaches in the difficult environments in which we're all working. And so today is really a unique opportunity to ask questions and discuss the results. It is also an important step to concretely learn and continue to work together to adapt our programming to reach a collective impact across the two countries. With all of you under RISE 2, our second major phase of resilience programming in the Sahel. So enjoy the webinar, and I look forward to exchanging with you to further solidify our approaches in Niger and Burkina Faso. Thank you very much, and back over to the organizers.
Thank you so much. Yeah, sorry. Just eager to get into the presentation, and that will be done through a video that we will start queue up. So Zubaida, if you can please start queuing up the video. And thank you, Peter. Thank you again for joining us and for those remarks. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. This is Tim Frankenberger, President of TANGO International, and this is Dr. Lisa Smith, also from TANGO International. We're going to be presenting the Resilience in the Sahel Enhanced Program Impact Evaluation key findings from the Recurrent Monitoring Survey that was carried out in 2018 and 19. I will start, and then Lisa will take over explaining both the methodology and the analysis. And I will end this, the discussion with talking about the program implications of the survey. So this RISE program, the goal of the RISE is to increase the resilience to shocks in chronically vulnerable populations in agro-pastoral and marginal agricultural livelihood zones of the Sahel. The program was going on for 5 years and was carried out in Burkina Faso and Niger, and you can see the areas of these two countries where the project was carried out. In terms of activities, these projects were trying to improve technology and management practices by ones that focused on agricultural production, others that focused on animal rearing. They also tried to strengthen access to markets and business development. They tried to improve access to financial services. They were trying to strengthen disaster risk reduction in the communities, as well as conflict mitigation. And they were trying to promote health and nutrition interventions as well. All of these were aimed at trying to strengthen household resilience capacities. The purpose of the Recurrent Monitoring Survey is to collect real-time data during the course of the actual shock on the nature of the shocks and how those households are coping with these shocks, and how the resilience actually enables them to manage. The opportunity to gain greater understanding of the underlying determinants of their resilience capacities, whether or not these are being influenced by program activities. This information helps to inform programming for the rest of the project and future project designs that come out of this. One of the main takeaways that is going to come from this presentation is that there is a high increasing shock exposure to the RISE communities that are operating in this area. The four main shocks in the RMS period itself were climate events such as drought and flooding, armyworms, violent extremism, and food price increases. 55 to 60% of the households were able to recover from shocks. And what helped them recover? Their own resilience capacities had a big role to play, particularly social capital, their assets, their savings, their access to informal safety nets, their human capital, exposure to information, access to financial resources and markets, and services and infrastructure. The RISE interventions played a role in this too, and you will see from the presentation how those actually fit in. So now Lisa will take over.
Thank you, Tim. So this is the outline of where I'm going here. Now that Tim told you all the results, I'm going to give you some more background information on how we came to them. First, some background on the survey itself, then some definitions, for example, definitions of resilience and resilience capacity, the two main concepts that we're working with here. Then we're going to show the data on shocks and coping strategies, on food security and resilience. And then we're going to give you the results of the analysis of what helped households recover from these shocks, including their resilience capacities and the RISE interventions that, that they experienced. And then Tim's going to take over and do implications for programming. So for some background on RMS, here are the 4 objectives of the analysis, the RMS analysis. The first was to understand the severity and evolution of the shocks that households faced over the RMS period, and also over the entire period of the RISE project. The second was to document the coping strategies they used to deal with these shocks. The third was to assess how resilient they were. And the fourth, the main goal of the whole analysis was to explore how households' resilience capacities and the RISE program affected their resilience. So we collected both quantitative and qualitative data for this analysis. The data collection took place from August 2018 to April 2019 over a period of 9 months. It was from a representative panel sample, and by panel we mean that the same households for which data were collected in a midline analysis were the households in this RMS. There were 828 households in the analysis, roughly half from Burkina Faso and half from Niger. And the data were collected in 5 rounds, 2 months apart. And if you look down at the bottom of this slide, you'll see a timeline of the data collection. There was a baseline survey in April 2015, 2 years later, a midline survey. And then between the midline and the planned end line was this RMS. And Tim was going to tell you that we actually, the end line survey didn't take place in April because of COVID. It took place in September?
Late August, September.
Okay, and that's where the main impact evaluation is going to take place, where we use really rigorous impact evaluation techniques. But meanwhile, the RMS was designed to give us a lot of information on how these shocks affected people and what could be done to improve their resilience. The qualitative data were collected in selected villages using focus group discussions and key informant interviews, and they were conducted concurrently in each round of the survey. So in terms of definitions, I'm sure many of you have seen this USAID definition of resilience: the ability to recover from shocks and stresses in a manner that reduces chronic vulnerability and facilitates inclusive growth. And for our analysis, the operational definition of resilience is simply the ability to recover from shocks. Resilience capacities are basically the determinants of resilience, the enabling conditions that households need in order to achieve resilience. And we measured 3 dimensions: absorptive capacity, which is the ability to minimize exposure to shocks and recover quickly if exposed; adaptive capacity, which is the ability to make proactive and informed choices about alternative livelihood strategies; and transformative capacity, which is the wider system in which households are embedded. For example, governance mechanisms, policies, safety nets, etc. This is the TANGO conceptual framework for resilience measurement and analysis, and this guided all of our data collection and analysis. It tells us everything we need to know to conduct a comprehensive and thorough resilience analysis. And as you can see here, on the far left is households' food security before a shock started. Then shocks and stressors need to be measured to understand the environment that households are facing. And then the determinants of their resilience capacities. You'll see absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacity. And then their responses, their coping and adaptive strategies. Now, if you look at the yellow lines going from pre-shock food security to post-shock food security, this gives all of the possible trajectories that households' food security can take when they're faced with the shock. And as you can see, that households food security typically does decline, and for some households, they will go into collapse, and some will recover some, but we consider these households not to be resilient. The ones that are resilient are able to bounce back to their previous food security or higher, or if you look at the dotted yellow line, some households are able to actually maintain their food security and stability in their food security. And these trajectories are what we're going to be using to measure resilience. So let's turn to look at the shock exposure of households. Over the entire periods from the beginning of the RISE program until the RMS, we measured shock exposure using an index that took into account households' reports of the incidence and severity of 26 different shocks, including environmental shocks like drought, flooding, economic shocks, and conflict shocks. And as you can see from the two diagrams on the right, shock exposure progressively increased over the course of the RISE program's implementation, both in Burkina Faso and Niger. As you can see from the baseline to the midline, there was a small increase in Burkina, but then shock exposure really shot up after that. And that's one of the reasons that the Recurrent Monitoring Survey was instigated, because people started noticing these patterns and knew that it was a time to come in and really understand what was going on. So looking more closely at the types of shocks that households faced, so there were 4 major exogenous shocks. That means shocks over which people had no control. There were multiple climate shocks, there were armyworm infestations, an influx of violent extremism, and food price increases. And if we look more closely at these climate shocks, there was households reported that they experienced drought, excessive rains and flooding, lack of rain at critical times in the agricultural cycle, and high winds leading to crop lodging. And in fact, the crop lodging, we were only able to detect that through the qualitative data because it wasn't included in the quantitative survey. This diagram here shows the stream flow deviation from the norm, which basically picks up on how much on drought and how much water is in the ground. And it's showing from the baseline through to the RMS what the drought conditions were for both Burkina Faso, the blue line, and Niger, the red line. And from the, you can see there's three gray blocked out areas. The left one is the baseline, and the middle one is the midline, and the far right one is the RMS. And between the baseline and the RMS, households were basically facing flooding conditions. These are, if you're above that black line, far above that, that's flooding conditions. But then right as the RMS started, there was a severe drought right at the beginning. That was in August 2018. that drought happened. So a lot of what we're seeing in terms of people's reporting is a result of them experiencing that drought and then trying to recover from it as they also experience too much rainfall in the later rounds of the survey. One thing that we picked up on was a large increase in violent extremism over the RMS period. Conflict shock rose, especially in Burkina Faso, but also in Tillabéri in Niger. And starting in RMS round 3, households started reporting that militant groups were attacking their villages, leading to large-scale displacement. And the downstream impacts of this were market disruptions, school closures, disruption of livelihoods, including agriculture and livestock rearing, gold panning, and petty trade, and hampered ability to receive humanitarian assistance at a time of great need. Here's some of the things that households themselves told us. They said that people were becoming more desperate and living in constant fear of being attacked. They could no longer go about their daily business without being scared. Everyone had become careful where they went and who they associated with. They felt they had lost their place. Their peace, excuse me. So you can see that this conflict shock, in addition to the climate and economic shocks that people were facing, put these households under a lot of stress. Now I'm going to let Tim tell you a little bit more about the coping strategies that the households were using to cope with these stresses.
So from the quantitative survey, we found that the most common coping strategies were selling livestock. But because they were selling livestock when the drought was hitting, they had very poor terms of trade. That means that the amount of animals required to buy a bag of grain was getting worse. So they were having to sell more animals to get the same equivalent grain. They were drawing down on their savings. They were reducing the number of meals that they were eating in a day. They were limiting the proportion size of those meals. And they were trying to reduce regular household expenses. Also, they were sending livestock out in search of pasture and water. Some families were migrating, relying on friends and relatives more to help them get by. They were turning to hunting, fishing, and forage, and tapping into termite mounds for food. They were selling off their productive assets, and they were consuming their seed stock. And from the qualitative study, we also found that they were heavily engaged in the sale of wood and straw and wild foods. They were trying to work as casual laborers in other fields and mortgaging land, going into debt to merchants. And when people are working on other people's fields instead of working on their own fields, it's very difficult for them to apply the new technologies that the projects are actually trying to encourage them to adopt because they aren't applying them on their own fields. And so that is a real problem. So from the qualitative study too, these quotes were kind of important. This year, the price of animals has been so low that even the money from selling 3 goats can't buy a bag of grain. The poorest families were collecting waste flour from their mills. And some of the negative coping strategies that were happening where people, as I said, were selling their productive assets. They were consuming their seed stock. They were sending their children to work for money. And particularly what made it worse is when the schools were closed because of the conflict, then the children were being used for this purpose more. They were borrowing money from money lenders, and they were taking children out of school. So this undermined their future recovery. So to cope with the animal diseases, many farmers tried to sell their animals before they died. And that actually drove the price of the animals down in the market because everybody was trying to sell at the same time. People also coped by reducing to 3 meals a day to 2. They were consuming more wild leaves and were consuming their own seed stock.
Okay, so let's go on to look at households' food security and resilience. And as I said before, we measure resilience using food security. For the three measures of resilience we use are using food security data, and one is a perceived measure that households are reporting. I'll get to that in a minute. But first, we need to look at how food security is measured. It was measured using the inverse of the household food insecurity access scale that some of you may be familiar with. And this is an index constructed from responses to 9 questions regarding people's experiences of food insecurity. And some of those questions, they range from just being worried to actually not having any food for a whole day. And we took the inverse of this measure because we didn't want to measure a food insecurity, we wanted to measure a food security. So here are the trends in food security from the baseline, midline, and through the 5 rounds of the RMS. In Burkina Faso, food security showed a stable pattern since the baseline. You can see this green line. From the baseline, the food security index went from 19.3 to 19.4 at endline. So there was basically no change, which was interesting. But in Niger, it showed a highly fluctuating pattern. It fell by 30% between the baseline and the last round of the RMS. And I just have to tell you that the baseline and the last round of the RMS survey both took place in April. So there's the pattern does not reflect seasonality. So food security fell by 30% between the baseline and the RMS in Niger. So that's where the resilience was the lowest, we'll see. Before we move on to look at resilience, I just wanted to quickly show you what the analysis that we did looking at which of these shocks actually had the most negative effects on people's food security. And what we found is that drought, poor rainfall timing, flooding, insect invasions, the conflict shock, and food price increases were the ones that had the most negative impact on people's food security. And we had a counterintuitive result as well, showing that these animal disease outbreaks were having a positive effect on people's food security. And Tim and I discussed this a bit, and Tim's theory is that what was happening is, as people saw that their animals were getting sick, they slaughtered them, and then they actually had some, temporarily did have some food to eat from those. So we measure resilience using 4 measures. The first 2 are called realized resilience, long-term realized resilience, which is the total change in food security over the 9-month period of the RMS, and then short-term realized resilience, which is the change in food security between rounds, which is 2 months. And the reason we call this realized resilience is because it's a post-shock depiction of how households actually fared, what really happened. And some measures of resilience are just predicting, looking into the future as how they think they might fare given what we know. But this is an actual picture of how they fared. And we had that data because we checked before and after what their food security was. A third measure is food security stability, and that represents that dotted yellow line in the diagram I showed you before, whether households were able to maintain their food security between the RMS rounds. And finally, a measure of perceived ability to recover, we actually asked households themselves how able they were to recover from the shocks they faced, and on a 5-point scale from did not recover at all to recovered and now we're even better off. So let's see. Using the realized resilience measures, we found that 60% of households recovered their food security over the RMS period and 40% did not. And that's quite a large share of the population. As we'll see later, it looks like the RISE project did help households recover. And so that number would have been a lot higher, possibly a lot higher if it weren't for the RISE project's interventions. We also found that a greater percentage of Burkina Faso households recovered than Niger households, and we saw that in the trends in food security before. In terms of food security stability, 55% were able to maintain their stability and 45% were not. And we don't see much of a big difference between the Burkina Faso and Niger households in that measure. We can also look at whether resilience has been increasing or decreasing since the beginning of the RISE project. We use that perceived ability to recover measure. And what we found is that for the RISE area as a whole, there was no change in households' ability to recover. But if you break that down by region, we can see that in Burkina Faso, the households on average experienced an increase in their ability to recover, and in Niger, a decline. So we're getting the same results whether we're looking at food security or we're actually asking households themselves about their ability to recover, which is good. So let's now look at what helped these households recover from the shocks they faced, starting with their resilience capacities. Now, these were measured at the time of the midline, so about a year and a half before the data were collected for the RMS. Okay, so first I need to tell you how we've measured the resilience capacities. We had roughly 26 indicators of resilience capacity, and we broke them down into the 3 categories: absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacity. And you can see what these are here, but I'll be talking about them a little more later, so you don't have to memorize them. But what we did to create indexes is we combined these indicators into indexes using factor analysis to get these 3 dimensions of resilience capacity and an overall index. And what we found is that households' resilience capacities did boost their resilience to the shocks they faced. Thank goodness. From a regression analysis we did, we showed that there's a positive association between overall resilience capacity and their realized resilience, a positive association between the overall index of resilience capacity and their stability of their food security, and also that households' resilience capacities reduced the negative impact of shocks on their food security. Saw before that we found that a lot of these shocks did reduce their food security, but this helped reduce that negative impact. And we illustrate that here in this diagram. This is showing how the trajectory of households' food security as drought increases over time. And what it's showing is that households that had the highest resilience capacity, which is the green line, experienced no reduction in their food security, whereas households with the lowest resilience capacity in the blue line experienced a sharp reduction in their food security. The mean household, the average household, experienced a moderate reduction in their food security. This is just an illustration of how these resilience capacities really do boost households' resilience, and those are what projects focus on to try to increase their resilience. Resilience capacities are the determinants of their resilience. What we found also is that one of the reasons that Burkina Faso's households did so much better is because their resilience capacities had a stronger impact on their resilience than Niger households. So here, if you look down at the bottom, I'm showing that Burkina Faso, the adaptive capacity, absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacities, all three of those boosted households' resilience in Burkina Faso, but only households' adaptive capacity boosted their resilience in Niger. And that's one of the reasons that they didn't do as well, households in Niger. Now let's look at some specific resilience capacities, and these are the actionable programming and policy levers that can potentially strengthen households' resilience. So they're really important to look at in terms of what projects can do to boost households' resilience. And what we found for the RMS period was that the ones highlighted in yellow were particularly helpful to households. Their bonding social capital, their asset ownership, whether they had cash savings in advance of the shock, and their access to informal community safety nets. Two other kinds of social capital called bridging and linking social capital. Their access to financial resources, such as savings and credit, their human capital, their education, training, their exposure to information, and then also under transformative capacity, their access to markets, services, and infrastructure. These all helped boost their resilience capacities. Three of those resilience capacities stand out because when we did the same analysis at the baseline and midline, we got the same result, that they really helped households with dealing with shocks. Bonding social capital, bridging social capital, and access to financial resources. Consistently across all of these surveys, we found that. And then in green here, I'm just showing the ones that showed up for at least two of the surveys. So, these ones that are highlighted here are the ones for which we have the strongest evidence to date that if they're strengthened, they could potentially have the biggest impact on resilience. And this kind of information is crucial to get these from these surveys so that we can help plan programming for the future. And that's why we do these surveys, especially the recurrent monitoring surveys. Okay, finally, before I pass it to Tim for the program implications, let's look and see if we're getting any preliminary information about whether RISE helped these households. And I just want to mention again that the Endline survey is designed to get a robust, rigorous impact evaluation into place so we can actually test whether these results are strong and true. But we do have suggestive evidence from this that we can look at from the RMS. So what we did is we had two groups of households, a treatment group and a control group. The treatment group was a high exposure households that had received resilience programming from either Regis ER or Regis AG, and I believe you're familiar with those programming activities, and the low exposure did not receive any programming from them. These groups were chosen at the beginning during the baseline when we chose the sample. Then we did regression analysis, looking at whether it made a difference whether they received these interventions or not. We used different types of regression analysis depending on which measure of resilience. And for those who are interested, you can read here what kind of regression analysis we used. And we controlled for household shock exposure, which is very important, of course, their initial food security, socio-demographics, their livelihood group, whether they were mainly focused on agriculture, pastoralism, or other livelihoods, and controlled for their wealth as well. And we also did a difference in difference analysis. I'll just move on from there. So for some descriptive analysis here, we're showing the difference for the high exposure and low exposure groups in the change in food security from the beginning of the RMS to the end of the RMS. If you look, for example, at Burkina Faso, you're seeing that the high exposure group had a higher increase in their food security, which means they were more resilient than the low exposure group. And this is statistically significant at the 5% level. For Niger, we also see that the high exposure group did better than the low exposure group. Not as big a difference, but it's still statistically significant. And then we also found, just to give you a better idea of what we found in the regression analysis, is that the project really did make a difference. That was descriptive before. This is now controlling for everything else, controlling for all those independent variables I listed before. We found that the RISE interventions have had a positive impact on households' ability to recover from the shocks they faced over the RMS period. It helped Niger households maintain stability in their food security in the face of a particular shock drought, that drought shock you saw at the beginning of the RMS period. The RISE interventions reduced the negative impact of drought on Niger households' ability to maintain their food security. And it reduced the negative impact of flooding on Burkina Faso households' food security. These are just some strong results that we found from our regression analysis. And as you can see here, we're just going to illustrate one of the analyses showing that as drought increased, our high exposure households actually improved their resilience, while the low exposure households saw a decline in their resilience. Okay, so just before Tim takes over, I wanted to point out that these positive impacts are due to the program's efforts to strengthen households' resilience capacities. And in the end-line evaluation, we're remeasuring these resilience capacities and looking specifically at which one of them were improved by which types of program activities. Okay, Tim, you take over.
Okay, so one of the things that was very clear is that because these households had been experiencing more shocks in the later years of the program, safety nets are becoming more important, particularly to prevent households from having to work in other people's fields instead of their own, so they aren't able to take advantage of the interventions being promoted in the ag sector. We also found that disaster risk reduction, which was primarily focused on droughts, needed to expand to include how to actually manage floods more effectively. Floods are extremely big problem in this region, and that's illustrated by the previous table that Lisa showed, where flooding was going on significantly, not only at the baseline and midline, but near the end of the RMS. Violent extremism has become more and more of a problem in this area, and so conflict mitigation, even though it's actually been a focus of the project, needs to get a lot more attention, because what we're finding is a lot of these communities that we were surveying, particularly the panel survey communities, many of them are being displaced, and internal movement of people out of the area is a real problem if you're trying to actually help those people become more resilient. They can't farm their land, they can't take care of their animals, they can't pursue off-farm employment opportunities like they did before. So that is preventing them from taking advantage of the investments that are being made. Next. So savings groups, we know, really did a lot to build social capital, and you can see across the many survey rounds that social capital was showing up as one of the most important capacities that needed to be in place to make people resilient. So continuing to invest in savings groups is going to be critical for maintaining that social capital. We also saw that adaptive capacity was extremely important in both Burkina Faso and in Niger, but transformative capacity was not so effective in Niger, and so there needs to be a lot more concentration on transformative capacity in the Niger context. I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. If you have any questions, please email us and ask them.
Oh, they're awesome. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Tim and Lisa. I am now putting a poll up for all of you participants. Please respond to the poll. You'll see it in your window. And before I display the results, I'm just going to give it a couple minutes or less probably to see if we can get some more answers in. So please answer the poll. You'll see it on your screen.
Okay, so it looks like a lot of people see value in this RMS. That's good to hear. We actually think that it is an important feature in any of the resilience impact evaluations that we do in other parts of the world, not only in West Africa. The advantage of it is that it enables programs to actually make adaptive management decisions as they're understanding how these shocks are affecting these communities and these households, how they're coping. And it actually can tell you when certain thresholds have been passed where it becomes very difficult for people to manage these shocks. And that's usually a good trigger for a social protection type activity that's shock responsive. So one of the things that we're trying to improve upon is getting information to decision makers faster so that they can actually make the right choices with regards to when to pivot when a program is experiencing overwhelming shocks like we saw were happening in the RMS here in West Africa. Over.
Thank you, Tim, and thanks to everyone who completed the poll. We're going to use the time remaining to engage you, the webinar audience, in a discussion of these RMS findings. And again, to enable that, we encourage each of you to use the Q&A function of the Zoom to pose any questions you might have about the findings themselves or their application to resilience programming in the region. Again, please do not use the chat icon since it'll be more difficult for us to select questions from the other comments entered in the chat. Before we respond to your questions, we'd like to give our panelists the opportunity to respond to a few of our own questions on the implications of RMS findings for resilience learning throughout the Sahel. Our panelists include Tim Frankenberger, President of TANGO International, Zarek Smith, Deputy Mission Director for USAID Sahel Regional Office, Kathy Younker, Acting Country Representative and Resilience Coordinator for USAID Burkina Faso, Abubakar Kosomi, Senior Resilience Advisor for USAID Niger, and Idrissa Isufi, Project Management Specialist for Resilience and Agriculture for USAID Niger. And I'm going to pose the first question to Tim. Tim, could you explain how the RMS fits within and contributes to the broader RISE learning strategy? And what questions are best answered via the RMS versus impact evaluation?
Okay, thanks, Tom. I think one of the things to understand is that the RMS is embedded into a larger impact evaluation that we're doing of the RISE program. And that RISE impact evaluation has been carried out through multiple surveys for the last 5 years. So we have a baseline, a midline, and we just completed the endline. What we're trying to answer with the bigger evaluation is what impact did RISE have on food security and poverty? What impact did RISE have on women's empowerment? Because I know that women's empowerment has been a big focus of the RISE program. What impact did RISE have on household resilience? Did the RISE comprehensive approach where they've layered, sequenced and integrated activities, did that make a difference? And which specific interventions were the most important in that regard? Now, the RMS, what it tries to do is gives us a real-time snapshot of how people are actually managing and coping with these shocks, and allows us to understand, that these shocks may be getting more severe and are evolving over time. And so, not only do we have a major covariate shock, but we have downstream effects of those shocks. So, for example, if a drought hits, it has an effect on markets. It has an effect on livestock disease. It has an effect on alternative opportunities for people to pursue other income sources. So we need to document this and how people are actually coping with those shocks. It also allows us to know whether or not households are resilient to those shocks through their adaptive strategies. And it allows us to determine whether resilience capacities are being strengthened by the interventions that are being promoted by the RISE program. So the importance of this is that it enables us to have information that allows us to make better adaptive management decisions. And that is critical when we need to pivot when things have actually gotten worse for these households and communities. So I think that the RMS is embedded into the larger impact evaluation, but it gives us a real-time picture of what's actually happening as people are managing. Over.
Okay, thanks, Tim. That's very helpful. Next, I'd like to ask Zarek about the relevance of RMS findings for USAID at the regional level. Zarek, from SRO's perspective, what are some of the most substantive or consequential findings from the RISE-1 RMS analysis? And how might these findings inform SRO's decisions related to regional and national resilience strategies, alignment with government policies and programs, and coordination across multiple USAID activities?
So thanks, Tom. Appreciate the question. I think the findings that demonstrate this positive association between household resilience and SRO programs, and that point towards what we hope will be a likely robust finding, or hopefully a robust finding in terms of the impact evaluation. I think it speaks to a couple of important things strategically about USAID's resilience activities. I think first and foremost is it endorses the critical importance of the agency's investment in learning and robust monitoring and evaluation, right? We wouldn't, if we didn't have a sense for the need of such a thing and have invested in it over long term, we wouldn't be able to benefit obviously from these findings. And so it helps me understand, and I think it helps USAID understand that we need to continue, and certainly we have in the RISE-2 design, continue investments in strong monitoring and evaluation. Additionally, I think we should be investing in host government capacity for learning and research such that they can contribute to their own long-term sustainability for this kind of learning. I think another important point that this helps us understand is that USAID needs to be able to respond and adapt our own activities at the speed of relevance, right? The RMS was put in place with the prospect that it could inform not only the next generation of resilience programs, but with the notion that we should be able to pivot and move as needed in, if not real time, at least in a smaller increment of time than what might be typical in a multi-year program cycle. And so we have equally, I think, purposefully built instruments with shock modifiers, with real-time adaptation capacity, recognizing that the kinds of new shocks and new threats that might come up are likely to come up. And so the RMS helps us to know in a much shorter time period when response is necessary. I think thirdly, in the context of adaptive programming and management, it also helps us recognize that our focus on shocks and stresses are critical in the Sahel, but we also need to be aware of positive opportunities and positive evolution in the operating environment. And so while the RMS is talking about shocks, stresses, and threats, I think a holistic view on what positive opportunities might be out there and that might represent pathways for growth or an opportunity where peace unexpectedly breaks out. We ought to be able to respond to those kind of shifts as well. And then finally, I just want to say that the concrete programmatic application, I think, of the RMS are really important as well. The finding of the importance of the rising trend of extremist violence and the need for us to be able to be responsive and take advantage, be responsive to the ways in which violence entrepreneurs are mobilizing grievances is really critical. So our investment in DRG-focused activities that look at local service delivery, as well as community engagement, youth empowerment, focus on, and youth opportunities that act as a counterweight to potential violence, extremist recruitment, are also important part of the picture. And linking those activities to food security and resilience activities in a strategic way is really, really important. So I think I'll leave it there. I had a couple of additional thoughts, but I want to give time for the rest of the panelists. Over.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. That's really helpful, and you'll have time to weigh in on the other questions that we field from the participants as well. And just following up on that, I want to drill down a little further on the potential application of this analysis at the country level. So we'd like to now pose some questions related specifically to resilience in Burkina Faso and Niger. So turning first toward Burkina, I'd like to ask Kathy a question that kind of builds on what you were just speaking about. Kathy, how might the findings from the RMS help USAID in implementing partners address the downstream impacts of escalating conflict and violent extremism in Burkina Faso? For instance, disrupted livelihoods, limited access to essential services, and/or limited access to humanitarian assistance.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for that question. And I think these implications have a lot of the findings have a lot of real implications. The study was completed a few months back, and I think for Burkina, what's really important to know is since January 2019, we've had over 1 million people displaced, including some of the participants of our Rise 1 programming. And I think some of the foundational skill sets, we have examples of people becoming displaced and using those foundational skill sets, such as literacy, such as using some of the, restarting businesses, leading different groups. And I think those, some of the aspects of social bonds and social systems, people can continue and bring those with them. They're portable skills. And I think it's finding ways to use those portable skills in these new environments. I think one of the other key aspects is also looking at ways we can continue on building off these lessons. So for example, in our Food for Peace development program, they've done some cash transfers. They have savings groups. And I think an additional shock we've also experienced this year is COVID and some of the market disruptions. So we've had market disruptions due to insecurity, and we have our producer groups moving to different places. But I think at that foundation, you have that, ways we can continue to build on what the tools people have. And in the Rise 2 programming, one of the focus is looking at local governance. And again, how do you empower communities to better manage, the resources that they have? And I think that's also an important aspect of ensuring everyone's brought in, because one of the struggles here is no one knows how long this disruption, this violence is going to continue, and how long communities will be displaced. And so I think for us on programming and looking at what maintains these resilient communities and resilient households is building on those basic skills that, as Zarek was noting, families can bring back with them if they are able to return home safely at some point. I'll leave that there because I'm sure our colleagues in Niger have a lot of other examples, and I'd be happy to answer additional questions as they come.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that, Kathy. So I have one final question that I want to pose to Abubakar from Niger. So it's a difficult one, Abubakar, and we're going to ask you to answer it as concisely as you can, because we're very anxious to get to some of the great questions that we're getting from attendees as well. But I wanted to ask you about the RISE RMS analysis that suggests a slightly higher percentage of households in Burkina Faso was able to recover from shocks than was the case in Niger. So from your perspective, what might explain this difference, and how could RMS findings be applied to further strengthen recovery from shocks in Niger through RISE 2?
Okay, thank you for the question. It is indeed a very difficult one, and I'll try to answer it to the best of my knowledge. I think what might explain the difference in the slightly high percentage of households recovering from shocks in Burkina than compared to Niger is that the nature and the severity of shocks and stresses in Niger has increased the level of vulnerability of Nigerian households. And what I remember is that during RISE 1, Niger faced a combination of shocks, including conflicts in 3 regions. There was conflict due to Boko Haram and insecurity in Difa and Maradi, and conflicts breaking in Tillaberi. At the same time, we had severe droughts. So I believe that's one of the reasons. Also, the geography of Niger. If you compare Niger and Burkina, Niger is almost 5 times bigger, larger in terms of traveling distances, making it more difficult for our partners to implement the programs. And I think that also did affect some of the results of our resilience interventions. And I think also that we need to take into consideration that Niger is a widely spread Muslim country, 95% Muslim. And because of that, we have a large polygamy that is very widespread in the rural households, and that increases also the burden on, the households, and that affects also our resilience program. Not to mention, that also in those households, the role of women is often needs, to be strengthened. Yes, I think generally that's sad, but in general in the Sahel, we also recognize that Burkina Faso has been through a revolution in the 1980s, and because of that, there was a profound mentality change, and people are more proactive when we compare. In general, we tend to say that Burkina people are more proactive than Nigerian people. So I'll stop there. And Idrissa, maybe you would like to add on the second part of the question?
Yes, thank you, Kosomi. On how could those findings, be applied to further strengthen recovery from these shocks through RISE 2, I think we would expect our implementing partners to provide extra attention to those specific aspects of the resilience capacities that have been shown by research, as we've just seen through this presentation, and also through experience, that are crucial to sustain resilience in the face of shocks, of course, and stresses. So these transformative development outcomes, namely community leadership of local development, the social capital, we've seen them well defined and well explained here, and more importantly, learning and adapting capacities should be further addressed. US aid will measure, of course, impact at the population level to determine how the collective effort is contributing to the goal. and transformative outcomes. And you have talked about resilience capacity index. We haven't yet done, but we have the health services delivery coming that will work on the stunted children, wasted children under 5, how they recover, and so on and so forth. So our implementing partners, we expect to address cross-cutting issues, of course, so that those recoveries be addressed and then be sustained. When we first talk about these development outcomes, transformative development outcomes that Tim also recognized are very, very important for Niger to have better rise to outcomes. Gender and youth, we really need to do a lot of work in there through these cross-cutting issues. Not only that they are worse positioned compared to the adult population, male population, and also that they can have an outsized impact of the well-being of other portions of the populations. And also we have to develop risk management system, social and ecological risk management system that TROV is trying to implement currently in Niger is a good example of that. We have, of course, the shock responsive contingency planning, and as Eric said, the provisions to those crisis modifiers that can help us to pivot, at the right moment are crucial, to the success of our programming. And in everything we do, of course, governance is key. So resilience governance that we have set in the 4th objective of Rise to will definitely strengthen through this RMS findings, the recovery phases that will definitely be needed after all these shocks. There are so many on depth and so on and so forth. Thank you. Over.
Yes, thank you very much, Idrissa. And thanks to other panelists for your responses. We'd like to now ask you to field some of the questions posed by our webinar attendees. And a quick note to those of you who've submitted questions via the Q&A function, we'll do our best to address as many of these as we can. If for some reason we're unable to get through each of the questions asked, RIO and SEC will work together to ensure that responses to your questions are made available to all participants after today's event. So I'll start with an initial question. This is a common one that we hear. I think I'll point this to you, Tim. Are you able to point to which interventions were most effective in strengthening household resilience?
Actually, not so much in the RMS. I mean, we had indications that any kind of group formation that actually leads to strengthening social capital is going to be important. But the impact evaluation inline survey that we just completed, and we're in the process of starting the analysis now, we will have detailed information about how each of those interventions that we're able to pull out, what effect it had on the different resilience capacities and what effect it had on resilience itself. So we'll have that information in a couple of months. Stay tuned.
Okay, for our next question, Maggie, I'm gonna see if you can help me out with this one, given that it's posed in French. Can you ask the next question posed and upvoted by several of the attendees?
Okay. What were the possible adaptations with households that were displaced? And were there comparisons between the households that were stable and those that were displaced? So I think this is, again, more of a question for Tim, having to do with what you saw in the methodology and sort of what you saw from the results. So again, just to clarify, what were the adaptations that might be possible with households that were displaced? And were there comparisons done between households that were stable, that remained stable, and those who ended up being displaced?
I think Kathy kind of answered that question already, at least for Burkina Faso. One of the problems that we have, because these surveys are panel surveys where we are collecting data from same households over time, once they've become displaced and we can't find them, we can't actually do an interview with them for the data collection. So on the end line, what we found, and I think there was another question, I think from Nancy, what we found was the displacement affected a number of villages that were in our panel survey. And so I think we lost a couple of hundred households because of that in our end line. But you know what's important in any of these impact evaluations is to try to oversample so that if you lose households for whatever reason, you still have a large enough set of households to do the analysis that we need to do. So we still have plenty of households to do the analysis, but we did lose quite a few as a result of the displacement, actually. Over.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. Another question for you. Any thoughts on why absorptive and transformative capacities were not as important for households in Niger as opposed to Burkina Faso?
You know, I think the comments from Boubacar, I think, were right on in terms of, you know, you have to think about the geography of Niger and how spread out it is and how less densely populated it is when you compare it to Burkina. And that also goes for services that are being provided to communities out there. And if the services are weak or, you know, are not as strong as they are in Burkina Faso, then the transformative capacity, the enabling conditions, the governance, the delivery of services, the infrastructure is just not going to be as good as it is in Burkina. And so as a result, transformative capacity is really critical for enabling your adaptive capacity and absorptive capacity to work. And so if people are totally dependent on themselves and they can't rely on other government services, or the cost of getting those services is very high, then it becomes difficult for them to take advantage of those transformative capacities. And so one of the things, the implications for programming is we need to be really focused on making sure that service delivery gets improved over time. And I know that in RISE 2, governance has become a very important part of what they're focusing on. And so that is going to be critical for improving resilience in Niger. Now, one of the ironies here is that Burkina Faso, which has a much stronger transformative capacity because their service delivery has been a lot better, infrastructure has been better, the conflict is going to be a huge problem for those. And so, you know, so it's not the fact that you're kind of underdeveloped services in Niger and well-developed services in Burkina, but now you've got this problem with the conflict. You know, it has an effect on resilience for different reasons. And so I think that that's why it's important that we are looking at both Burkina and Niger separately so that we can make sure that we take the different contexts into account. And one of the things we don't want us to have happen is the program in Burkina compares themselves to the program in Niger and they say, look, we're doing better than you guys, when in fact, that's not the case. You have to take the context into account, and how much room do you have to maneuver is really important here. And so I think we can learn from both of those examples. And I think that that's an advantage of having it in two countries like that. Over.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. The importance of context. I think we all appreciate that. And, you know, in terms of context, we've seen from the RMS and other resilience analyses, the importance of social capital. So I wanted to pose a question, and perhaps this one is best fielded by those based in Burkina Faso and Niger. What other suggestions for programming interventions might you have to support bonding and bridging social capital? And I'll leave that open to you, Zarek, or Kathy, or Abubakar, Idrissa, whoever wants to field that.
Very quickly, I'd like to say the VSLA activity, Village and Savings and Loans Association activity, has been a tremendously successful activity, and I think it's one of the main activities along with animal rearing that we can be proud of, and that helped really create a strong bonds within the community and strengthen the community, and also provide, gather local resource and provide access to financial resource, no matter how small. But that was enough for a number of people to, move out of extreme poverty and have something significant that made them proud and made them feel they belong to a community. And I think that's a very positive asset. Thanks. Over.
I'd like to just build on that a little bit, because in Burkina, as well as in Niger, we had the producer groups that work together through the warrantage system. And I think whenever you have groups working together, that's a foundational way to build that social cohesion and social capital. I think it's really going to continue to be a struggle in an environment with increasing amounts of conflict and displacement, and especially when we look at the communities that, you have some communities here that have quadrupled in size in a fairly short amount of time, and then you have communities where you have some of the members of the groups that have become displaced, and I think that's going to be a real challenge to find ways to build back that social cohesion. But it goes back to the local governance that I brought up earlier, and others have, where you have your communauté villageoise de développement, and you have local workers, you have almost sometimes volunteers, but you have people who are really out there building the community. And I think that is another way to continue ways to build that social capital. And I think we do need to be creative, because I think based on the RMS findings, as well as what the realities on the ground is, how can we infuse that almost in every part of programs? Because I think there are ways to do that thoughtfully, as we're looking at both RISE as well as some of USAID's other programming here in Burkina Faso.
Great. Thank you very much, Kathy. Once again, we have another. Yes, go ahead.
Can I just make one comment there? I think it was a very important point that Kathy made with regards to households absorbing other household members. That actually was considered a shock by some households in the qualitative stuff. When people are normally have 8 people in their household and now they've got 20, it becomes very difficult to feed everybody, and so they almost consider that as an idiosyncratic shock that's affecting their household. So I think that's an important thing to keep an eye on as we go forward. Because households are essentially shock absorbers, and they tend to take in members when other communities get displaced, particularly, and so that's important to emphasize. Over.
It is. Thank you very much for that, Tim. So Maggie, I'm going to ask you to read out the next question in English. It was posed in French, and then we'll have the French interpretation for the response.
Yeah, it's a bit similar to some of the points you just touched on, but I do want to highlight it. Did the culture of solidarity, such as the community organizations, the very local level community organizations and support mechanisms, was that seen as a factor that was important between the two countries in terms of resilience as the results, within the results or within the data you received from the focus groups?
Are you asking me?
Sorry, I didn't target that. Yes, in general, I'm asking you, but I think it would also probably be helpful to hear from Niger or Burkina if they have more details on sort of understandings around I think we understand that there definitely is that solidarity that can help increase resilience, but did the data really show that in all aspects, and when you triangulated it between the qualitative and quantitative?
Yeah, I actually, we do try to capture that information in the data that we collect. And when we do see a lot more interaction between groups within communities, that tends to be stronger solidarity within those communities. But I would be interested in anything that the two countries can actually point out that as insight.
Idrissa or Kathy, I don't know if either of you want to jump in here. It looks like maybe they aren't able to get off of mute at this time. So I think we can move to the next question. But I think that is something that SCC is ready to look a little bit more deeply at in each of the country-specific discussions that we're going to be hosting in the near future.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maggie. The next question, and this will be for Tango as well. Did you consider the humanitarian assistance mainly in food and cash assistance following the displacement of people in terms of the positive impact on households' food security and their absorptive capacity?
As I said before, we aren't tracking the displaced people because they're not in the places where the villages were before. So again, I think if AID could probably answer that question better than we can.
Zarek, Kathy, Idrissa, do you have any insight into that question for us?
Tom, could you sorry, restate the question? I
sure could. Yeah, I sure can. It was a question about whether humanitarian assistance was considered, and specifically food and cash assistance following the displacement of people in terms of its positive impact on households' food security and their absorptive capacity. Now, the RMS analysis spoke to this somewhat, but I think Tim would like to get USAID's perspective on humanitarian assistance and the extent to which it is helping strengthen that absorptive capacity among targeted households.
Well, among the displaced is what the question was, right?
Well, so I mean, I think what we have to say about our humanitarian assistance is that programmatically it is administered singularly with the objective of saving human lives and reducing human suffering, consistent with humanitarian principles. And so the high level objectives, of course, are somewhat different when we talk about humanitarian assistance. We of course don't deliver humanitarian assistance in ways that would put people in danger, but we also have to be very careful about the methods and the means by which we administer it. So it's a little bit trickier in the humanitarian sphere, I think, to have a strong opinion about maybe a corollary benefit that might be able to build social capital and could have some longer term benefits in the humanitarian sphere. I think it's probably more reasonable for USAID and other donors to think about that question in the context of Nexus program. So what kind of complementary development activities could be paired with humanitarian assistance, with the humanitarian assistance doing its job in a neutral and focused way, trying to save human lives, whereas Nexus activities that come from a development perspective can and probably should be programmed in such a way that they have some of those longer term benefits. And to be honest, we do have at least one current Nexus pilot in Burkina Faso that's focused on water service provision for communities that are hosting large numbers of IDPs. And so I think there's an arena where we are purposefully linking development and humanitarian assistance, respecting the proper role of humanitarian assistance, but taking advantage of the resources that are being invested in humanitarian and complementing them with development assistance that would reasonably be more responsive to the kind of building of social capital and building of institutional capacity that the questioner, I think, is intimating is important. And I would say I agree very much. Over.
Okay, thank you very much, Zarek. And we see many great questions remaining. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. But on behalf of both REAL and SEC, we really appreciate your participation today and hope the discussion has been informative for everyone, especially those of you delivering critical assistance to communities in the Sahel. We do want to remind everyone that REAL and SEC are planning to facilitate more in-depth conversations on the implications of resilience evidence among country-specific stakeholders in both Burkina Faso and Niger. So please stay tuned for updates on that. In the meantime, the full RMS reports and briefs are available on the REAL webpage in both English and French. And I think you'll see this link in your chat box. And we'll do the same with recordings from today's event. And finally, before you go, we ask each of you to take just a few short minutes to complete an evaluation of the webinar at the link provided in your Zoom screen, because your feedback will really help us make sure similar learning events are as useful as possible for everyone who attends. So with that, I'd like to say thank you again to everyone, our attendees and our panelists. Thanks to TANGO for carrying out this really important analysis for the Sahel. And we'll ask everyone just to enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.